Hi everyone, and welcome to this video called How to Analyze a Visual Text. In this video, I'm going to be explaining how you go about analyzing a text that perhaps has no words and what that might look like for any kind of visual text. So this is more of a general introduction to look at general features, and a particular thank you to Matrix Education. I have used a lot of their resources in putting together the definitions today. So before we start, what I thought we would do is have a look at an image and think about some of the things that you might identify and some of the things that draw your eye, so that if you had to say something about this image, what are some of the things that you might say? So pause this video here and jot down a few ideas. We are going to revisit this later. So for a general overview of some of the terms we're going to look at today, we are looking at these here. They are not the only features you can unpack, particularly if you're looking at a very specific text type like a political cartoon. There are always more features you can unpack, but this is a nice general introduction to some of the features you will find. So the first one here is called allegory, and this is where a text will often have a second layer or a second meaning or a different interpretation beyond the visible or literal one. So as a perfect example, Sean Tan and John Marsden's book, The Rabbit, when you first read it, it seems like a story about rabbits arriving in a new land and what that experience is like. However, when you dig a little deeper and you do a bit more analysis, you realize that this is actually an allegorical fable about colonization, and more specifically, the colonization of Australia. And so you can then look at the meaning, behind the rabbits and the numbats and some of the other symbols and figures in the text. The second thing we look at, or the second thing from our list, is allusion. And this is where you allude to anything else beyond the text. It could be a work of art, it could be a novel, a play, a historical event, an idea, some kind of figure. And you can see here in this example from The Arrival by Sean Tan, these figures here really allude strongly to the Statue of Liberty in America. So looking at this moment of arrival into a new place, and you're welcomed by a large figure, and you can see that playing out here in the harbour. The next one we look at is angle, and this is, it's easier if you have a photograph because you have a camera that's being angled in a particular way, much like we would look at for film analysis. But it can also be used for hand-drawn or painted artwork as well. And it's really about conveying a point of view. So you can use a low angle, a mid angle, or a high angle, and it's usually used to communicate some kind of power dynamic. This is also related to framing, so we will revisit this later. The next one is body language and gaze, and this is really referring to the figures that are within the visual text and looking at their facial expressions or their gestures or how they're standing. And it's really trying to convey attitude, feelings, and personality. A really good one to look at is eyes and their gaze and some of the things that might be trying to be communicated by the illustrator with that gaze. The next thing we look at is called composition, and this is really about how all the visual elements within the image are actually composed. And we talk about composition in terms of arrangement. So the artist or whoever is putting the image together really looks at things like proportion, balance, harmony and potentially disharmony to produce some kind of visual impact. So if we look at this, for example, where we've got an interview with Sean Tan and he's discussing his images in The Rabbits, he's talking about scale. So when the rabbits first meet the local creatures, which are the numbats, they are tiny figures in the frame. And this is really to highlight how powerless they are and that the landscape is actually really dominant. And then as we progress through the story, the rabbits become increasingly dominant as they take over the country. So in here, you can see that the composition of these images really illustrates that change as well. The next one here is colour, which hopefully is a bit more of an obvious one. We really look at not just the difference between black and white and colour, but also the meaning behind certain colours and the contrast of light and dark. So quite often blue might look quite calming, usually it's a calming colour, but in the context of the rabbits, blue is also quite an artificial looking colour. And if we look at the browns and soft sand colours of the earth over here, that's really contrasted with the bright and artificial colours of your bright blue and your almost neon green and pinks. And that's really used to communicate messages about the differences between these groups of animals. Similarly, over here you can see from the arrival we have some colour changes. So you might like to think about what is being communicated here as well. Okay, this one I have a little asterisk next to context because it's not technically a visual feature, but it's a really important component to discuss. And this is basically what's happening to inform this artwork or visual text. So it's the cultural, historical, social, situational, and personal circumstances that this text is composed and respond to. So for example, in rabbits, we've already talked about how it's an allegory of colonization. And so here we have Sean Tan discussing this political issue and also this concept of what's normal and belonging. And that's really informed his work. And so context is a really interesting feature to discuss, even though it's not technically an element of the image itself. The next one here is contrast. So again, like we talked about with color before, contrast is really great to talk about the differences between elements of the image. And it doesn't just have to be color, it can be anything. And this also relates to juxtaposition. And when you place two extremely opposite things next to each other, it really highlights their differences. So in doing that, you juxtapose them, which heightens the contrast. Next one is framing. And we talked about camera angles and shots before, but this is really considering how this frame is composed. So not only where is the camera held, but also how are the figures in the image being framed. And if you think about this as quite literally a frame, what's included, what isn't included, and what elements are we allowed to see? So you might think about size and the size of the subjects, maybe the relationships between the subjects and what might be highlighted by framing them in a particular way. And also the balance between the elements on the left and the right, or the top and the bottom of the screen. Okay, the next one here is layout, and this is quite simply as it sounds. It is how the elements are laid out on the page, and this is usually referring to text and images. So it could be that you have several images on a page. It could be that you have text arranged within a certain way in an image, like we have here. We have the text fading off into the background. It could be that some elements look nice and square and clean, and other elements look quite ripped and thrown on the page. All of those choices have an impact on the reader in some way. The next one is orientation. Now, if your book or if your visual text stays the same the whole way through, this often isn't a good one to unpack, but quite often authors of visual text will change the orientation to have a particular impact. So it might be to get the audience to engage with a page more or consider a new perspective, and that's just something to keep in mind if it does change. The next one is symbolism. So symbols in text often represent something beyond just being the object, and quite often they can represent an idea or a theme. So if we look at the arrival, for example, we have this almost dragon creature, and that definitely symbolizes something specific to that text. You also have these little figures that are recurring the whole way through the text, and they actually carry deeper meaning. Text style is another one, and this is really about how the text is presented on the page, if there is any text. It could be something interesting about the font, and you can see that in Sean Tan's Lost and Found, we have some interesting text used. It could be the color, the size, or just generally speaking, the style. So all of those choices are going to carry meaning as well. Now, tone is another one here. So tone can refer to light and dark. You know, there's a dark tone in this image, but more importantly, it speaks to the overall mood or feeling of the text or the image. So this image here carries a real sinister tone because not only is it dark, but we also have this figure that is overwhelming the frame. It looks quite frightening. These people are quite small and made to look quite powerless, and we have a real deserted, empty alleyway. So all of these things together, you might like to think about some of the other visual elements that are contributing to this tone, but this tone is certainly clear in this kind of image, so it's a great one to unpack. Now, online I found a book that Sean Tan has published where he has basically talked the reader through all of his creative decisions in putting together The Arrival. So while it's interesting to look at the literal interpretations of these and him saying, you know, this event is going to happen, then this event is going to happen, what I thought was more interesting was looking at the creative decisions and what he was trying to highlight with each of them. So for example, having a close-up on the girl and the emotions that he wanted to communicate. Or in this one here, having the high angle to change what the audience can see and to change the framing of the figures in this image. There is another example here where you can see in the scribbles around the border, Sean Tan has made some more creative decisions. So I recommend having a look at that one online or purchasing that one if you are interested. It's just a great way to see how artists are actually considering these elements when they're creating. So, to revisit our overview, these are, like I said, some general terms to get you started. And hopefully now, when we revisit this image, you can start applying some of those terms to this image. So have a go at that one, and I hope you learned a bit about visual imagery today. Bye.